guys, welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast Coffee Break Sessions, the show where we cover foundational Treasury topics and questions in about the same amount of time it takes you to drink your coffee. This is your host, Alexa Cook, joined again with Craig Jeffery, Managing Partner at Strategic Treasurer. Welcome back, Craig.
Hey, thanks, Alexa.
Yeah, thanks again for joining us today. So today we're going to jump in and cover what is benchmarking. So Craig, do you want to give us just maybe a quick high-level overview of what benchmarking is?
Yeah, benchmarking is in the family of measurements. How do we measure what we're doing? And benchmarking is comparing yourself, your practices, your standards, your financial performance to others. So it's making a comparison of others of like size or complexity.
Okay, that makes sense. So really, who's using benchmarking?
Yeah, so benchmarking is coming back into vogue now. It was very popular 15, 20 years ago, and then sort of fell into somewhat disuse. But many areas in AP and AR use benchmarking, particularly production areas have used that more heavily. Treasury hasn't used it as much in the last decade or so, but that's starting to change. They're using it to compare not necessarily all of the functional activities, but practices, security, controls, use of tech, some different areas that are different from what benchmarking used to be, but it's the same practice of applying what are others doing compared to what we're doing. And that's also a reflection on the broader issue of measurements. What should we be doing and what's world-class?
So really, you kind of jumped in and started answering my next question, which is how does this apply to Treasury? And I know you touched on different treasuries are looking at their different practices or their security and their controls, maybe even their uses of tech. But I guess I'll just jump back to my question. Really, how does this benchmarking apply to different treasuries?
Yeah, I think most people find Treasury is really useful on things like risk management, security, the use of tech, staffing, staff development. There's a number of other areas as well, but when we look at those, you can see people are saying we want to do as much as we need to do, as much as we should do. One key measurement is what are others doing, what are leaders doing, and how does this change over time? And so this helps you make sure you're not falling off the back of the pack. For those that want to make sure they're always reaching at least a standard of good corporate conduct, but it also helps those who say, what should we be doing? And one indicator of that is what are others doing? But it also allows you to reflect when you see the movement towards world-class practices and leading practices around areas like use of different payment types, different formats, the technology infrastructure, the use of BI, the use of artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, some of the use of these technologies. How are we gaining skills and facility with those? It's useful because it's a more formal way of seeing what others are doing rather than the two or three people you talked to in the last 6 months. So by capturing a much larger segment of the population, you can see the trends of what's happening, and that's a good place to start. It's not the ending point, but it's a good place to start across all these different, skill domains and expectation domains.
That kind of leads me to a different question. So this is a little bit different than I'm thinking of level setting, right? So this is not quite level setting. This is just kind of taking a look at the market and seeing what everybody else is either charging. I'm thinking in the sense of AP or AR, or I guess what kind of technologies they're using, and just kind of doing a quick comparison to see whether it's the technologies, the securities, or I guess pricing even, and just kind of putting yourself in comparison to everybody else, right? And not really level setting it.
Yeah, I think there's different terms and interpretations how we look at it. But if you think of adoption of new practices that are better, that may be leading, that may even be world class, they get adopted by a small sector of the companies, and then it becomes adopted more heavily. And other companies are using practices or security measures or principles for determining their exposure or risk elements that are falling out of vogue or are no longer adequate. And you can think of lots of examples from security to the use of tech across the board. And so this is quite, I'll say, just really quite helpful as a way of saying, where are we in that mix? Where are the bulk of companies operating? What are the leading ones doing? And then that's part of the discussion of what do we have resources to do and where should we be operating? What level? Are we going to do the minimum? Are we going to be a leader? Are we going to be world class? But we have to know what those things are. So knowing where you are compared to others is a good starting point. It's a measurement of like depth perception. I can compare to others and see where I sit.
So then how frequently should treasuries or APAR, or I guess really anybody, be doing these different benchmarkings?
Yeah, so when I hear that, I think back when I remember first hearing about benchmarking years ago, and it was someone who sold benchmarking, was saying that, and they'd say every, year to 18 months. And I remember physically rolling my eyes about that. So, the idea of some benchmarks you might need to do annually or more frequently than annually, but bear with me for a moment. Some of them you might not need to do, but every 3 years or so, or just when it's an area you can focus on. So something like security, I think you should benchmark every year to 18 months at the most. There's so much changing that's going on. It's important. Same thing with technology. Maybe the use of staff development is something you do every 2 years or every 2.5 or 3 years. But I think you can list and say what's happening and figure out what your organization can take on. If you're not doing any benchmarking, why not start and see what the value is. If something's changing slow, you don't need to do it every year, every 2 years. There's only so much you can absorb bandwidth-wise in terms of making measurements, making changes. So, yeah, I guess that's a really general answer. So it's 1 to 3 years. How about?
Okay. So I think we're at about time for this. So I'll just do a quick recap, starting with what benchmarking is. So really it's just a quick comparison of, I guess, what you're doing in comparison to others. And then really anybody can do benchmarking. It can be APAR. It could be, traditionally it's been heavier in production, but now we're seeing it applied in treasuries, whether that's practices, security, controls, uses of tech. And it's really looking at what others are doing and how we can maybe apply that. And I know you said that security was important, and really looking at new and emergent technologies and how maybe different people are spending on these new and emerging technologies. And as we just said, that frequency doesn't need to be annually, but maybe it could be as frequently as 1 to 3 years, depending on kind of what's coming out into the market and what's applicable to your organization's treasury.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything there? Did you want to add?
Yeah, just real briefly on the 1 to 3 years. So certain areas you may want to do every year. Others you just need to look at occasionally. So it depends on what's occurring. So security, yes, look at it every year, 18 months. Maybe there's other practices that don't need to come up as regularly. But the other thing I didn't mention when we talked about measurements is you can measure yourself against others, and it needs to be those that are similar in terms of complexity. Complexity can come in different areas: size of organization, number of countries you operate in, different elements of risk. So those are key. You don't want to necessarily make any type of comparison across the board. And so having it honed into your type of organization's complexity is probably the most important part of that. The other measurement, of course, that's not really part of the topic of this, is how do you compare with yourself over time? How are you making improvements to your organization? But yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining me today, Craig. And again, to all of our listeners, make sure you tune in every first and third Thursday of the month. And if you want to reach out or have questions or comments, you can reach us at podcast@strategictreasurer.com. Thanks again, Craig, and thanks to all our listeners.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.